is no longer going to continue the way it is, the aversive one. That is the not unacceptable one. And then we have all kinds of very subtle ways, so that one of the things at this point, if we were in a smaller group and we had more time, what I would do is to demonstrate that. Let's say, for example, and you all know this game of this parlor game of we hide something, and then we send someone out of the room, we hide an object, and we say, okay, now your job is to go in here and find it. And we're going to give you feedback based on what you're doing. So if we have hidden something over here, and you're over there, we say you're cold. And then you start taking a step or two this way, we say, oh, you're getting warm. You're getting warm, you're getting warm, you're getting hot. Now you go over here. You don't go over there. Once you get the comment from me that you're getting hot when you're here, you don't go here, you never go back there. Why? Not because you have a mind to find the object over here, but simply because, based on your experience, over there did not pay off. Over here, you've never gone to. And here, you're getting the positive consequences. So it simply behooves us, and any teacher, and I'm sure there are some in this room, who use these strategies are very much aware of how they can observe a child's behavior change very rapidly under proper contingency management. Meaning, I as the teacher am sitting here and I'm saying, what I am going to do is reinforce with positive consequences going into this corner. I am not going to reinforce any behavior over there or any behavior over here. And very quickly, as the individual moves about in space, there is a differential that happens, and that is, this one is the one that really, if you will, attracts the individual, or this is where the behavior increases in probability. Okay, when we have a political situation, and this has been, I must say, the history of the Bund. It's been the history of other left-wing organizations, and that is, we argue. You know, you're an idiot. You really don't know what you're talking about. How could you possibly say that? Now, that certainly doesn't sound like a positive consequence. So you know what? You're a person I'm not going to talk to, you say to me, because all you did was insult me. But yet, that's our bread and butter, if you will. It's just that we are so programmed now that I am convinced that I am right, you are convinced that you are right, and we don't agree. Now, instead of chit-chatting and seeing, you know, like, let's change the situation. We're going to go out on a date, and we're going to determine where to go out to eat. You don't say to the other person, you know, you're an idiot. How could you possibly like this kind of food? What you say is, well, I prefer that food. Or we use a milder punishment. And a milder punishment is saying the word no. No, I don't feel like Indian food. I feel more like Greek food. And the other person then says to themselves, let's say, just to have an imaginary conversation, I really want to be with this person. That, you know, the meal is a meal, but I really want to be with this person. That's where my reinforcers are. Okay, that person wants to go to a Greek restaurant. I'll say, okay, that's fine. I may not enjoy it, but I'm going to do it just to reinforce that person. And in politics, we haven't learned that. You don't compromise with the fascist. You know, you just put it down and you say, this is it. Well, yes, that's true. But then, you know what? There's going to be no conversation. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to say that that person is correct. And part of the reinforcement comes, and we see this very often, I enjoy talking to that person, not because we agree, because we don't agree, but the reason I like to talk to that person is because that person is very intelligent. Meaning, what that person is saying is causing me to consider things that I hadn't considered before. And Michael's comment is very appropriate. We all learn something. So now, you know, I never thought about what you just said. And that, to me, is an important development. So even though I don't agree with you, and I really want to call you names, I get reinforcement from your intelligent comment or question, which now forces me to think about something that I hadn't thought about. And this is something which I think we need to really consider as secularists. My phone went down, so I don't know. Okay. There are other problems that come in the way. We enjoy crossing streets here, not because they're safe, and not because you people are driving on the wrong side of the street, but you know, you push an arrow, a button, and they go. All of a sudden, you hear a timer going, and then it changes to showing a little green person, so you can walk across, and you can then proceed safely. Well. And I'm sure you've seen this very often. You're going, you push the button, and this is true for elevators and what have you, you push the button, and you're waiting for the light to change. Somebody comes along, pushes the button, and it turns green. And that person is saying to himself or herself, this other person was just standing there, I guess. You know, it's a good thing I came along and pushed this button. Now, the observation is clear. The person pressed the button and the light changed. And you're saying, not so. And what do you mean not so? That's exactly what happened. I'll play you the tape. No, you're not going back far enough to show how there was another person who pressed the button first, and we know in the circuitry of it that this is the way it is. Well, that's nice when we know these things, but when we don't know them, then we have to restructure the thing and do an experiment. And that's what research is all about. So research is not simply doing an observation, and before I mentioned earlier, I had mentioned empirical validation. Well, the person who pressed the button just moments before the light changed empirically observed that it was his button push that turned the light on. But experimentally, what he needed to do was to go to more situations where there's somebody standing at an intersection and do what? Fold his arms and wait. And at some point, it changes. So that it is not necessary for him with the golden push that he's going to change the color. It's that this was the pre-programmed situation. So in discovering, and this is where a lot of the excitement comes into science, is that, yes, I observed this, but how do I know that this is really not the observation that I needed to make, because you made that observation and that's correct. Observations are always correct. What is not correct was the inference of the relationship between the second person's button push and the change in the light. That was incorrect. And that can only be ascertained when you really do an experiment, which means some of the time pre-programmed, I wait for 15 seconds and I push the button. I wait for 2 hours and I push the button. I push the button after 1 second, and so on. And then after a while you will discover whether there's a regularity, as there, for example, with the appearance of the sun in different places and so on. Okay, social behaviors are reinforced in the very same way, but we have 3 sources of reinforcers. One is the personal. When I say something to you and I say, oh, that's good, or thank you for doing this, those are positive reinforcers for behaviors that you have done. And now you do them with respect to me. However, it is moral. One should behave in this manner. It's not something that you pick up from necessarily from another person, but those are within the context of a group, a religious order, let's say. Our religious order says this is the way that behavior should occur. You should not lie. Oh, yeah? Well, what happens in lying? If you tell the truth, did you break that lamp? You're going to get punished. If you tell a lie, did you break that lamp? Oh no. Did you play ball in the house and break the lamp? No. Okay, well, you better not. So that you avoid the punishment by telling a lie. So now, talking about events that are not truthful gets reinforced by avoiding, or postponing, if you will, the punishment. And that is done not necessarily by an individual, but it is more often by a group, by an organization. As secularists, we don't say this. Okay, now I know. You've told me how to behave. There's usually not a reason beyond that's the way we do it. Okay? Then you have a third level, and that's the legal one. I don't want you traversing an intersection with a red light, because that's very dangerous, especially to me, but to other people as well. So if you do, we are now going to punish you so that you reduce the probability of going through a red light or speeding or whatever else. And that's done by a legal framework. So there are behaviors where the child taking a step by himself or her step is reinforced gleefully by the parents. There are behaviors that we do it as a group, but within a certain context, which we call moral judgment. And we have yet another one that is legal. And with each of these, the contingencies become much more strict and usually much more negative. So to reinforce people positively is usually done much more on a person-to-person level, and to punish, you know, it's like when you get a letter from a university that you've applied to enter, and all you have to do is read the first word to know whether you've been admitted or not. It's either I or we. And that tells you the difference between the punishment and the positive reinforcement. I am pleased to inform you that you have been admitted. Tells you right away, great. we regret to inform you, is punishment. So all I'm saying is that when we look for causes of behavior, how behavior is maintained or altered, we want to see what are these laws that we're following. And the laws, as I say, could be, and in this case, the word law that I'm referring to is not the legal issue of law, but rather the scientific one that says there is a relationship between the behavior and its consequence, and there's a relationship between the environment and the behavior. So if I see gray skies and they're getting darker, the likelihood is that I'm going to carry an umbrella, and that increases with just the signs of what's going on up in the clouds. When it has nothing to do with the intrapsychic or things that are going on between the ears. Well, if that's the case, one of the things that we as behaviors, and in this case as secularists, need to look at is what is it that's needed to be done in order to go from here to there, from a child who is not walking or not reading or is making a lot of noise or is wiggling in his seat or is interrupting the teacher or whatever else it is. And school is always our working laboratory because there we're constantly in the business of changing behavior, that we look at the antecedents to the behavior, and the antecedents include the present environment, what's going on around here, and the historical ones, and look at how the behavior is occurring, what is frequency, intensity, and so on, and the consequences, whether they're positive or negative. So from a secularist point of view, we are talking about, the best term is doigkeit, right here and now. How do I intervene? So, do I laugh at the class clown who is disrupting the class? Because if I do, I'm going to reinforce that behavior. So it's not just that I'm responding to this individual, but I'm having an impact on this person's behavior. And we have always said, I mean, socialism was very strong on the scene to point out that the reason people are poor, contrary to what the bosses say, is not that they're lazy, but it is, and then you fill in the blanks. The reason that a person commits a crime is not that this person has a criminal mind, double whammy, but rather the circumstances that led to this. Now, if I am hungry, if I'm from a poor family, and I see some very reinforcing things, whether they're the candy or whatever else, money or whatever, that I can then shoplift, not because I have a criminal mind, not because my genetic makeup is that of a criminal. You know, there was a time when people felt bumps on the head to identify criminals. But rather, what is it that came about in this individual's history? It may be simply that I, as a hungry kid, observed that somebody else was able to walk by and simply pick something up and do it in such a manner that he didn't get caught. So, okay, I'm going to try it. And sure enough, I try it. Sometimes I succeed. Sometimes I don't. I get caught. Okay, now my task is to become a better thief. And that's exactly what I learned from my fellow inmates when I'm incarcerated. Hey, I got caught doing it. Well, that was stupid. You shouldn't have done that. You should have done it in this way. And then you'll never be caught. So what happens is, instead of our putting these characteristics, these abilities, if you will, in quotation marks, into the individual, whether it's being a musician, or being a writer, or being an artist of some sort, or being whatever, we need to look at what does it take to create this kind of an individual. And socialists have been historically at the forefront of generating programs that answer those questions in that manner. Whether it's social reformers, whether it's revolutionaries, we have come up with, you know what, this is the way it's going to come about. And if you read not only the literature of the movement, but the songs and the slogans, that's exactly what we learn. What do you mean freedom is the recognition of necessity, says Marx? That's very profound. It isn't that freedom is, I do whatever I want, whenever I want it, wherever I want it, however I want it. No, that's not freedom. The word responsibility is one of those overused words. What do you mean responsibility? Well, it's your responsibility to show up on time. But if I've overslept because the night before I was working and was very tired and so on, I'm sorry, that's not acceptable. There is no such thing. And this is where we come down to the push comes to shove. There is no such thing as behavior pathology. You're not sick. What you are is you have learned certain patterns. And instead of punishing you, we better examine that behavior. Instead of saying, somebody taught you the wrong behaviors. Somehow that just doesn't seem to be acceptable to people. But it's the reason that you are behaving the way you are. When I ask you, how come you are now whatever it is that your activity is? I'm a student at this university or at this high school. I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer, I'm a whatever. How come you're doing that? The only answer you have is not, well, I kind of like going into this area. That doesn't tell me anything. But on the other hand, if I retrace and I say, oh, so you went here and this is what you learned, and then you went here and this is what you learned, and eventually this is how you came out. Now, instead of blaming the individual for the criminal behavior, what we need to do is to say, punishing this individual isn't going to do it. What is going to do it is to teach this individual a new way to behave. And, this is what trying to think of the camp, not the Melbourne sanatorium, but the camp. This is exactly what they were doing. And whether we're talking about socialist camps, or of course the one that I always refer to, based on my background, is The Road to Life by one Makarenko, who eventually became the head of the education department of the Soviet Union right after the Bolshevik Revolution. And there is a marvelous film that Eisenstein did on The Road to Life, showing children's co-op. But then, what I'm doing, in a sense, is bringing something, and I'm sorry that I'm doing it, to the choir. I'm preaching to the choir here, because if we look at Skiff, what you've got here is a mechanism for shaping that behavior, and you're doing a very good job of doing it. You've got leadership, which is the agent of bringing about those changes, whether it's the curriculum, whether it's the environment, whether it's the reinforcers. You have small groups, so we're not trying to change the behavior of 100,000 people in a stadium. It's coordinated, meaning we go from A to B to C. We put right foot, left foot, left foot in that sequence. And this is all what has been very carefully laid out. It's goal-directed. We are identifying what the end product is going to be and where we are now and how we get from where we are now to where we're going, which means that person A may be at a different place than person B or person C, and the curriculum then has to be matched to the individual and their history. And of course there's, as I say, a starting point and an end point. We know where we're going, so that when slogans are being said, it isn't, oh, isn't that interesting? No, it's very instructional. It's very directed. It isn't just something that sounds nice. It's very specific. So you've got a recipe, is what I'm saying. In the process of doing this, there's nothing wrong with now identifying this as a, say, group spirit. We've got a group spirit. Well, spirit, hey, that's one of the words that I put on that forbidden list. Okay, I don't care. Call it what you want. But now, operationally, I know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about spirit. I am not talking about something in the ether. And by the way, when we talk about spirit in a bottle, we're referring to something very specific. Even though it's an outmoded term, if you will, but it's very operational. So that all, again, I'm preaching to the choir, but what I'm suggesting is that we look at, as secularists, at constructs that we bandy about and talk about things like, this person, we're going to have to change his mind. I don't know what that means, but I do know how we're going to get this person to be more involved, more active, participate with greater energy, greater enthusiasm, and we can measure those things. This person shows up for 20 hours a week instead of once every other week or something. Again, there is law and order in the universe in the same way that if I were, and I'm not, going to release this phone, it would definitely not go up to the ceiling or remain here. Or to put it another way, when you see a so-called magician, an illusionist, do something, what's the first question we ask when we see that happening? How did he do it? Now what does that mean? It means, I know the laws of physics, and I know the laws of physics do not permit for something that's an object to just vanish. So this person did something within the laws of physics that fit this situation, but I cannot reconstruct it. Of course you can't, because he spent years working at this, and you're just on a momentary observation. And this is what political movements need to be aware of. Instead of simply waving flags and yelling slogans, and I know that every political group is guilty of that, there is a necessity, and I hate to say it, but the Jugend in Germany in the 1920s and 1930s went through exactly that kind of training. And it is no accident that we had, whether it was communist youth, whether it was socialist youth, whether it was whatever youth, we went very lawfully, from a behavioral standpoint, lawfully process of getting the individual from a bright-eyed, naive individual to a very skilled individual. And that's true whether we're talking about a surgeon, whether we're talking about an orator, whether we're talking about, whatever activity. The activity goes through that process, starting with, again, you take a young child who is throwing a ball, holds the ball up here, the ball just comes down and falls at their feet. We don't say, nah, that's not the way you do it. We say, hey, terrific. And then the next thing you know, they're throwing the ball, a certain distance in front. And then after a while, it's way over there. And then after a while, it's not way over there, but it's way over there to a specific target. So they're able to get that ball into the basket from quite a distance, whereas at the starting point, it was nowhere. And this is the same thing, the same process, but the difficulty is when we're talking about ball throwing or walking, we've got the observation and the physical measurement right there. When I'm talking about political astuteness and ideology, that means we have to operationalize it. We have to know what it is, how we're going to formulate the concept of cooperativeness. I mean, let's face it, if two people are pulling something, are they cooperating or are they competing? And how do we differentiate that? And the answer is quite simple in that case. In a tug of war, you've got two individuals pulling where they are reciprocal. That is, the pulling in one direction is negative for the other one, positive for this one. Well, so the contingencies of reinforcement in cooperation are such that says, if we do such and such, we both will get a payoff. In competition, it's either you or me, not both of us. And of course, the ultimate insult to the society is we give trophies and medals and honors to whom? To the people who don't need it at all. The ones who are the speeder, the best runner, the best weightlifter, whatever it is. They're great. They know what they're doing. They don't need any more medals and honors. But the poor individual who's barely coming along but making progress gets overlooked. I mean, granted, that's a simplification, because there are many, many teams, as we all know, where the reward is given for most improved, best spirited player or whatever. But again, when it comes to politics, we have to take the time, in the same way that we develop curriculum and we set our objectives very carefully, we have to know where it is that we're going, how to measure this, how to operationalize it, and then proceed. Whether you're doing this in the classroom or whether you're doing this as a political organization, you have to do it that way. And that's, if anything, that's the lesson that we have learned, that we must recognize that these laws do apply and they are correct, but you have to use them. You have to know how to implement them. Okay, thank you very much. If there are any questions, I'm sure some of this is...
Okay. Can I ask a very different kind of question? You talked earlier on about secularism being a freedom from religion.
Yeah.
And the separation of church and state. So theoretically in America you've got the freedom from religion and the separation of church and state. you know, the number of references by politicians to religion in a country and in a society that theoretically separates the two, I find quite surprising. How do you account for that apparent contradiction?
Is there really a contradiction, or is it the way things are implemented? For example, I would not agree that we have freedom of religion in the United States. Oh, freedom of religion we do.
Freedom from religion.
But freedom from religion we don't have. If I say, or never mind me, if Barack Obama were to make a speech and ended with, "Thank you very much for listening," the next day the papers would be tearing him apart. Why didn't you say, "God bless America and God bless the American people"? I mean, we don't have that, and what happens is that it's just assumed that, of course, you're going to believe in a deity. Oh, you have the choice of whichever deity you want, but you've got to have a deity. And I won't accept that as being freedom. It's you know, we're put in a position of, you pick whichever one you want, but you've got to have some. You can't say, God doesn't exist, or I don't know what you're talking about, or I couldn't care less.
One of his speeches, though, I can't remember which it was after the first election, his second term, he actually said, "We are a nation of blah, 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 and non-believers."
Yes, oh yes.
He actually said that.
Oh yes, yes, and that's acceptable. That's acceptable. That he is a non-believer, he will not say. But that we know that there are people here. In the same way as, you know, we have gays, we have lesbians, we have whatever, bisexual or heterosexual, whatever. But he's not going to say, this is the way I do it and this is the only way to do it, or whatever. In the same way, he will not forego, nor will any politician forego. And I'm, if nothing else, as a Bernie supporter, I'm watching to see Bernie get elected and give his first speech and say, as a socialist, you know, he's not going to say this is sheer nonsense, but I'm just going to go on that some of you believe and I don't, and that's it. I don't think that would be accepted.
Yeah. How as a secularist do you approach somebody who totally rejects that approach? Well, obviously we've got Islamic State, we've got Boko Haram that totally rejects that, in fact fights against the very notion of it. How, you're saying the secularists, we should try and engage them in discourse, in finding some way of talking to each other. And you also made the point that you said you don't talk to fascists, you don't talk to Nazis, there's nothing to talk about. How should secularists approach that?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because we're faced with a dilemma here. If I engage in a conversation, I'm reinforcing that behavior. If I try to punish it, that individual will completely cross me off the list as a reinforcer. So I will no longer be able to impact that behavior. Sometimes, let's make it a little simpler. Sometimes if we're dealing with an individual who talks about hearing voices, you know, voices tell me to do this and to do that. Now, I can argue with that person and say, what voices? I don't hear any. Or, you know what? You're crazy. There are no voices. I'm not going to get very far. One of the strategies we use, but it's got to be done very carefully. I mean, all of these have to be done carefully. You remember, one of the things about engineers is that they are very, very careful about what they do, and they're very precise. Otherwise, that bridge is going to collapse. So that here we're doing behavioral engineering. So that, for example, I pick up my phone and I start talking because I've got a white coat on. I'm a doctor, and it's excusable. So and I do that when that person is telling me about the voices they're hearing. And in fact, there's no call. I'm just doing this as a strategy. That behavior of talking about hearing voices is going to diminish. Especially if I then very skillfully talk to him about the football game that we just were watching, or that just happened. So that we talk, and I reinforce the behavior of that which is clearly real, is observable, namely watching and talking about the game. That he hears voices or not, I have no way of observing. I'm not saying that he's not hearing voices. I have no way of observing. So any behavior that I cannot observe, I am not going to reinforce. And talking to him will reinforce that behavior. So what I simply do is I pull out my phone and do that, or, excuse me, I have an urgent business to attend to right now. I'll be right back. Just the break of going out of the room and coming back 30 seconds later is enough to reduce that verbal report about hearing voices. Now, at some point, if I do it systematically, I'm going to get to a point where I get no reports from him about hearing voices, and when we're talking about practical things, they'll go on. Now, immediately the response is, but he's still hearing voices, and you're not attending to his problem. And I say to that statement, how do you know? How do you know that he even heard voices to begin with? And the answer is that which I cannot observe, I can't deal with. How many angels dance on the head of a pin is a nonsense question. Not that there are X number of angels dancing on the head of a pin, or it depends how big the pin is, or how big the angels are, and then how do we propose measuring that? No. That is just not a legitimate question. And while some people may argue that that individual is hearing voices and you need to attend to that to treat this person to become normal, I say to that person, nonsense. And because if, in fact, the person who reports hearing voices no longer reports hearing voices, you know what? That's everybody in this room. We define pathology as excess behaviors of whatever sort. There are very unacceptable behaviors the behaviors of the Nazis at Auschwitz was unacceptable. That it is pathological is begging the question. That it arose out of certain conditions that we could spell out? Very likely. So, you know, we're faced now, for example, I participated in a group of children of Holocaust survivors having a dialogue with children of former Nazis. Granted, it was a biased group on both sides. The children of former Nazis disagreed very strongly with what their parents had done. And of course, not to minimize, they lost the war. So that's another aspect of it. But now you have the question. Do we now, for example, blame these kids for what their parents did? And we'll all say, oh, no, I mean, they didn't. Well, why is that? And so we reinforce that behavior. We can get into a whole bunch of problems when we define pathology simply by observing the behavior and forgetting, I mean, the behavior is unacceptable. I'm not minimizing that. But we also have to then identify what are the conditions that brought that behavior about. If none of you were here right now, and my behavior is what it's been for the last hour, somebody might say, you know what, I think there's something wrong with you. And yes, that's true, because it's not just my behavior, but it's my behavior within an environment. Anyway, I'm sorry, there were a couple of people who wanted to say something. You wanted to say something.
I did. It wasn't specifically about applying it. You just said specifically, especially early on in your seminar, that you would reject the terms spirit, mind, etc.
Yeah.
Are you rejecting the existence of those things? So are you rejecting the existence of a mind, or are you just rejecting applying them in a physical environment?
What do you think my answer would be?
I honestly don't know. That's why I'm asking.
That's probably would be my answer. I don't know what you're talking about. I all of a sudden have gone deaf and I don't understand the language that you're using. Meaning that we have not accepted each other's terms. All right? If I talk about spirit and I say it doesn't exist, that's not what I would say. I would say, how do you propose that we know whether there is or is not this entity that you're describing? Mm-hmm. So now I'm putting the burden on you, and you would have to come up with it, and you would probably say something which would make sense to you and make absolutely no sense to me, because we're not talking the same language. See, when I'm talking about physical measurements, and it isn't just simply the operation and the quantification, but its relation to me as I've measured it. In other words, when I say that individual is spirited, I'm talking about how high the individual is jumping and screaming and waving arms and so on. It isn't the thing that one might conceptualize as going on between the ears, which is what I think most people asking about spirit and so on would be referring to. So it's like my talking about the person who's sitting in that chair right there. And you say to me, what person? That's the challenge. So now the burden is on you to tell me that there's a person there. And how do you know? I'm not buying. But you better, if you're coming up with it, you better sell it.
No, but I understand what you're saying, that the process of providing evidence for any kind of axiom should be based upon the person who is proposing said axiom.
Right.
But what I'm instead trying to ask is, like, are you denying that person's or anyone's specific, like, belief in that axiom? So if someone believes that they are thinking and that minds are, you know, something intangible, are you denying that that person perceives that they exist and hence shouldn't be recognized? Or are you just saying that, like, I cannot quantify it and I can't observe it in a physical environment?
I do not know what you're talking about, is what I'm saying. In other words, because I can't measure it, because I can't observe it, I don't know what you're talking about. You telling me about that now can at least generate something that would be evidence for me. But it burdens on you to do it. You see, it becomes very problematic for us to be, for example, where I am right now, what I am doing, we can all kind of describe. I'm standing here, I'm so many meters from this one, and so on. The initial of the middle name of the person about whom I am thinking at this moment, you will never, ever, ever know. You won't even know that I'm thinking about a person. I might be thinking about a blue sky. So that's what I'm talking, that's the distinction I'm talking about.
Okay.
I am saying, if we're going to talk about this, talk to me about where I'm standing, what I'm doing, because that, you know, you might say, you know, that was not a nice thing to do or whatever. Fine, we can talk about that. But the other becomes absolutely impossible to communicate. There's no way for you to find out the initial, the middle name of the person about whom I'm thinking. But if I were to tell you, the person about whom I was thinking was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, do you now know the initial of the middle name of the person about whom I was thinking?
Yes.
No.
Because that could be a false statement.
I'm a liar. I'm a liar. All you know is he said Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, that's the initial of the middle name about the person whom I just uttered. Not that I thought of. Because you will never, ever know who I was thinking about. That's the difference. Okay? What the other side of the moon was like before we had space exploration was open to all kinds of speculation. All of it, well, not all of it, because some of it, I mean, was based on engineers and the statisticians and what have you, the astronomers, having a pretty good idea. So that for some of us, when the pictures were taken, we said, oh, isn't that interesting? I didn't realize that. Most of the people working in the industry said, yeah, big deal. I mean, we knew that. You know, when an airplane takes off, for many of us, it's, wow, it's a miracle. No, it's not a miracle. I mean, they know exactly what they're doing, and, you know. You have, no, I'm sorry, yes. You.
Yeah, I want to go back to the person who says that they hear voices.
Yes.
So often people who have a problem that they're dealing with come to somebody and are not heard, or they're distracted, or their problem is minimised, and then it doesn't go away. It goes away for you, but it doesn't go away for the other person.
Right.
All the person has learned is this person isn't someone I can turn to for help.
That's right.
And therefore that person is in greater danger
Absolutely.
with their problem. It's like the government saying, look, we turned away the boats. Now people are drowning really far away from us, so that solved our problem.
Yep. There was a study reported back in, must have been in the mid-50s, where they applied this strategy with a group of, in a mental hospital in Saskatchewan. And the strategy was, I mean, they listed several different cases, but one was of a woman who talked about the illicit sex affairs that she had had and the number of children that she bore or had aborted and so on. And the staff determined that this is not valid. She never had any sexual experiences and so on. Okay. So what are we going to do about this? She said, okay, I know. We will, when she starts talking about the affairs she's had, we'll just ignore her. And see what happens. Okay? After a while, she's looking around, she says, I know what you're doing. You're ignoring me. Well, I'm going to go talk to the gray ladies. They're the volunteers on the ward, because they listen to me. Well, from my perspective, yes, that person needs a lot of help. One of the help is getting rid of that verbal behavior. Now, obviously, that verbal behavior is not occurring in a vacuum. It came about for some reason that other people in that situation didn't simply generate. It's lawful behavior, in other words. Why is this person talking that way? Well, I don't know. But by diminishing that behavior and replacing it with more acceptable behavior, and again, this is done very skillfully.
You're saying that victims of abuse have to have the onus of having to prove it?
No, not at all.
Because otherwise, if you can't prove it, don't listen to them and diminish their behaviour by not listening?
Victims of abuse would be treated in a much different manner given this behavioral strategy. It isn't that we ignore the experience. We now have a situation, and you know, we could go back to Pavlov as well as to Skinner and say, okay, you've had this experience. We'll call it trauma for simplifying it. That behavior occurred. The consequences occurred. And it resulted in your not being able to do certain things. We are now going to give you the skills that will allow you to
I'm
function.
talking about prior to that, the situation when someone comes and says, I've been abused, these things happened to me in my past. You can't prove it, they can't prove it.
That's right. So now, at that point, what I do is I will see, it's different when you're talking about having had an experience or not having had an experience. I was robbed at gunpoint, I was beaten by my parents, I was sexually molested by, and so on. All of those are, whether they occurred or not, I don't know. But I will now start with that as your given. This is what you report. Now, what are we going to do about that? What we're going to do about that, has this interfered with your functioning today? And if it has...
The person that hears voices, obviously that's interfered with their functioning. That's
right. But the point is, I don't know that they hear voices or not. I have no evidence of that. That you experienced some event, some traumatic event. Now we can deal with that, and for example, I can measure physiological reactions to that. So that now we can diminish the intensity of that response. I cannot do anything about the voices that you're reporting, whether they occurred or not. And it's not that I need verification, it's that I need to know what variables are we talking about. When you're telling me that you are now, for example, your coping skills are now affected by this experience. We can do nothing about the experience, but we can do something about the coping skills. And how we respond is very important, because now let me turn tables on you and say, if we foster helplessness, then we are victimizing that individual all the more. On the other hand, and I'm not saying that we should ignore the whole thing, that's not what I was proposing, but now we're going to deal with how to modify that behavior which enables you now to cope in a way that you haven't been able to. And that's why people seek help, because not necessarily because they're hearing voices, but because there is something that they are not able to do. And that's where we can modify the behavior that would be required for coping. I understand that we are functioning from two different systems. And I'm not challenging and saying that, all I'm saying is, if you want me to pursue a real world, then we need to deal with reality and not with unmeasurable and unobservable kinds of events. And trauma is something that you can measure. Hearing voices, no way. I can't even tell you whether it did or did not occur, but I can't even see an impact of that.
Okay. One last question.
Okay. What do you call the entity? You talked about observing, measuring, deciding. What do you call that entity that's doing it? What is the I that's deciding it? If it's not the mind, do you have a name for that thing that's operating in that, making those assessments and measuring?
Of what is doing these things?
Yeah, what is it in you? You're talking about I observe, I notice, I can measure, then I can decide, I can prove, and the other person can. So what is it within the person that's able to do that? What do you call it? Do you call them?
Me. You're looking
So
at...
you just call it the I or the me or the you rather than giving it some... So if someone calls it the mind, it's not really...
No. It's not that I enter into this at all. I don't. How many people are sitting in this room? It's not me. We're just counting, and it says, okay, this number. The physicist does not deal with a room being cold or warm, or being well lit or dim. That's not what the physicist does. When you ask a physicist, they'll tell you and give you units of measurement. They won't say this is a dim room or it's a bright room. That's what we talk about in everyday parlance. But that's not where the science is, and that's not the technology. We will never modify this room to be comfortable unless we talk, as the physicist does, about degrees, etc. And I don't enter into this picture, nor does the physicist, nor does the engineer. If you will, in fact, reports are usually written in the third person, in a passive voice. To strengthen this bridge, it is necessary to add such and such at such and such place, etc., etc. It isn't that I am going to do it or that I am observing that there is a structural deficit or whatever. it's in the function itself. So I'm not in the picture.
So who's the we? Who's writing the report? Is there some entity that's the observer? Who's the observer?
Oh, well, that's very important, because if the observer is not competent, then you're not going to get a very good report. But I don't care who that is. Again, it's written in the passive voice. This is 5 centimeters in length. I don't care who says it.
But what if that passive voice is like, as you were saying earlier, what if the passive voice is lying? The whole point is that regardless of, like, as humans, as beings, like, we are, like, inherently subjective. Everything we perceive is inherently subjective, and so even by writing a report in a passive voice, in the third person, you can still make, like, leaps in logic that aren't reflective of real life applications. And the fact is that even, like, with dealing with reality, is, like, we can only perceive reality through very certain, like, systems. So, for example, our photoreceptors in our eyes, we aren't dealing with vision in any other way other than the initial thing. So everything that goes on besides that is inherently subjective. So this is the only quantifiable way. The amount of photons hitting the photoreceptors in my eyes is the only way to quantify what could be a visual experience. We can't quantify anything other than that.
Oh, no. That's not so. I mean, in the early days of what was called psychophysics, we talked about the personal equation. And what was the personal equation? An astronomer had a tube he was looking through, and there were crosshair, and he had a time mechanism, and said, oh, okay, that star, as I observed it, crossed this particular line at such and such time. Okay, which of course was an error because the star didn't cross it, but never mind that. Okay. But his assistant would constantly come out with a different number, slightly different. And he said, oh, you know, that's just a personal equation. You see things one way and I see things another way. No. That was just the beginning, okay? At that point, we had a much closer agreement between the phenomenon that was occurring and the report of it than previously. You know, oh, look, there goes the sun. It's beginning to show daylight, you know, that kind of thing. But with time, we developed instruments and said, you know what, exactly what you said. This is not acceptable. Your eyes and my eyes. So now what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to find some other, and it's not an I or a me, it's going to be some other instrument which will automatically sense that and record it out.
But to take it back to a simpler example that you just spoke about, you could have 3 engineers that examine the same bridge.
Exactly.
And one says, this bridge needs a support here, and another one says, this bridge needs 2 supports here.
Right.
And the third one says, and perhaps all of them could be legitimate. You're not going to know because you're going to choose one of them.
And if you choose one and the bridge collapses, you say, well, I guess I was wrong. You know, I didn't do it. But from a scientific point of view, none of those would be acceptable. What would be done would be, you know, you not only measure, but then you talk about variance of measurement, and you talk about tensile strength, and you talk about different metals. It may be that they're all right, that where person A measured, absolutely correct. Where person B measured, which was 2 millimeters over that way, absolutely correct. And a third person was way on the other side of the bridge. You know, why is it that bridges fall? Well, one very obvious thing that sometimes engineers don't or didn't take into account was simply the fact that sometimes the conditions of the solar relation to the bridge and so on, that heated or cooled the bridge, whether it was in the shade or in the sun, something that was additional to simply the measurement of the location. But you're absolutely right. If that's the case, then we have to identify not just whether something is empirically the case, but now we turn around and we say, okay, let's test it out. And so you poke things and see whether, in fact, something does or doesn't happen. What I've summarized is really a very simplistic statement. But the fact of the matter is that most of us get very bored when we look at engineer reports, because all they are columns of numbers, and they don't even give you a kind of a evaluative statement where you say, "No, okay, so what do I do? Do I put this in or do I not put this in?" It's much more complicated, but it's similar to the recipe that our grandparents or grandmothers especially did. Well, what we did is we took a handful of this. Now your hand is bigger than my hand, so now what? Well, in science, one of the critical variables is not whether in fact we could describe what's going on. That's just part of the picture. Whether we can replicate. And you know what? Sometimes what you used to do for time after time after time, and everybody enjoyed it, this time the cake didn't come out that way. And in some cases we don't care. All right, so big deal. But in other cases it becomes very critical. I mean, when you think about orbital, space stations and shooting from here to there, wow, how do you do that? Well, that's the way we see it. The people in that business, they're pretty relaxed. I mean, granted, when it happens, they all explode and cheer and so on, but it's not with they don't lack the confidence we do. And all I'm saying is that in addition to the measurement, to the observation, which absolutely varies, if I'm standing here versus I'm standing here, my observations will be very different. But when you're talking about phenomena that are scientifically measured and engineered, then again, precision, whatever that necessitates for that situation, is what you have to work with. So more or less is okay for most of us. 1 millimeter is too much of a variation for others. And that's, but I'm sorry, we've gone far afield from where we started out, but I appreciate that we do have different points of view, and that what goes on between the ears is something that a lot of people like to speculate about. Poets write excessive volumes, and philosophers, or as we used to say in the old days, the rabbis would drehen mit dem groben Finger. They go, sometimes this, and yeah, we accepted that. It's time for us to now look at, not that those are idiots and these are the correct people, but how do we bring about that change? And that's much more difficult and much more challenging.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? For you.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you for coming along. Really hope to see you again.
Okay, I've loved this visit, and my wife has loved this visit.
It's been a great having you here.
Great.
And just seeing copies of those on it.
Thank you very much. Okay, yeah.
I was supposed to, only until 1, it's gonna happen.
I've got to set something up, but they're dropping him off at my place around. What are you doing? I've got a meeting in the morning. I've got a lunchtime thing I've organised. 12 to 1, he's got to be in the factory at 3. Yeah, he's got to be at another meeting at 7.
I'd like to agree with
I imagine he's somewhere on
I hope I didn't bump it too much.